Hello and welcome back to Round the Table. This is episode 46 from The Meeting Point, broadcasting not only to Bilbao but around the world. This week our topic of discussion has been influence. We've been discussing the biggest influences on your life. We've been discussing critical turning points in your life, tiny chances that drastically change the rest of your destiny, as it were. We've been discussing the influence of traditional television and newspapers, and also the internet, and of course influencers. We'll be talking a bit about that later on. We've also got coming up your typical mistakes of this week. We have an interesting word. We have pronunciation problems, we have an amazing fact or two, and we have a new feature, suffix of the week. How exciting is that? So first, let's look at your typical mistakes. We have two typical mistakes this week. The first one is the word familiar. Familiar is used to describe something that you know very well, something you've seen many times. It does not refer to families. Right, now, quite often, if you are going to do something at the weekend and you're going to meet all of your family and go for a meal, for example, in English we would make a compound noun, use family as the adjective, even though it's a noun, I know. But you could use family and put it with meal or gathering and say we're going for a family meal. And use family, I know it's a noun, but you could use it as an adjective in that compound. We don't use familiar. If you had a familiar meal, it would be something you've eaten many times before and you know it well. So familiar is not the same as family. There might be certain contexts when we use it to refer to families, but normally we use family, the noun, in a compound, like a family gathering is when all your family come together to meet. The second one that we had to look at this week is a word that not many people use, throughout. Throughout. This is a mistake that people have made throughout the week. So in sentences like throughout my life means in all of my life, from the beginning to the end, throughout my life. You can do something throughout the week, you can do something throughout your childhood or throughout the 20th century. So all the way through from beginning to end we use throughout. Don't use along. A lot of people say I did this along my childhood, for example, and that's not correct. It's I did this throughout my childhood. Okay, so we only had two major mistakes in my notes this week. Obviously there were lots of other mistakes, but they're familiar ones that we've seen many times. And yes, they are familiar ones, you see. Mistakes we've seen many times are familiar. Nothing to do with my family. So, not any other mistakes for you to look at this week. So let's move on to this interesting word. And the interesting word is the illness flu. When you say, I've got a flu, I've got the flu, sometimes we say the flu as if it were only one. I think it's more than one, but we say the flu quite often. Like a very serious cold. The full name of it is influenza. Most people just call it flu, but the full name is influenza. And the topic of the week is influence. And influenza comes from the same word as influence. The reason being that in the past people were convinced that the planets and things affected our health and our well-being, and they thought that catching the flu was something to do with the moon. For some reason, I don't know why, but they thought the moon had something to do with it, and it was the influence of the moon that caused influenza. And that's why it's called flu. And that is your interesting word for this week. Okay, now, are you ready for a brand new jingle? It's Suffix of the Week. And this week's suffix is going to be wards. W-A-R-D, sometimes with an S on the end, as in toward, toward, or backward, backward. You see the pronunciation of it changes a bit. In backward we just say wood, backward, forward. Some people put an S on the end. I think the S is more common in British English than American, but it's optional anyway. So you can have forward and backward. You can also use it with inward and outward. If something is going in, it's inward. You can also use it for the points of the compass. So westward is going in the direction of the west. You're going in a westerly direction. Westward Ho was a book that was written a long time ago. Eastward, northward, southward, in the direction of those points. You can also go homeward, in the direction of your home. There is an old piece of music called Homeward Bound, about going home after a long journey. You can also have upward and downward. You can also have heavenward. It's very rare, I know, but it's going to heaven, and skyward and things like that. Wayward is someone who's lost their way, which is strange. A wayward. And also untoward is something very unusual and not quite correct, which is a strange looking word, untowards. So ward is a very interesting suffix, I thought. Now this ward is not connected to the noun ward. There is a noun ward which can be somebody you look after, like an adopted child would be your ward. It's also a room in a hospital ward, where you look after the people. It's also related to warden. This second ward is related to warden, somebody who takes care of prisoners, for example, or traffic wardens, look after the traffic and make sure you don't park in the wrong place. And of course you have a wardrobe, where you look after your clothes, wardrobe. Now you see this ward sound, W-A-R-D. You would think it would be ward, yeah, because it's got A-R in it. But no, it's pronounced war, because something strange happens with the W, which brings us on to pronunciation problems. Often when you've got a word with AR in the middle, it's pronounced R, like car, for example, car and far, and words like that. When you put a W at the beginning, it seems to change it, so the AR sounds more like or. So if we take the word ward, ward, W-A-R-D, ward, rhymes with lord, and war, W-A-R, war, rhymes with door. If we put an M on the end, we get warm. It's not warm, it's warm, and it rhymes with storm. These words with AR, they sound more like OR, really. But the words with OR sound more like ER. Now listen to this. Work, work, rhymes with perk. If you know what a perk is, it's like an advantage in work. Word rhymes with nerd. Word, nerd. In fact, a word nerd is a bit like me, really. Someone who really likes words and etymology could be described as a word nerd. But word and nerd rhyme. World rhymes with curled, and worm rhymes with term. So you see, when you've got a W at the beginning, it changes that vowel sound in the middle of the word, and that was our little pronunciation problem this week. This is an aubergine. An aubergine. Yes, we use a French word, aubergine, with a j in the middle. At least In Britain, we call it an aubergine. In America, they call it an eggplant. An eggplant. What? Are they crazy? No, there is a reason why they call it an eggplant, and this is an amazing fact. The aubergines you see today bear little resemblance to the aubergines of the past. If you look at an old-fashioned aubergine from I don't know how many years ago, they were small, round and white. And they do look like eggs. That is why Americans call the aubergine an eggplant. And they're not as crazy as you might think. This is a fir cone. It comes from a fir tree. The fir tree and the pine tree are almost the same thing. In fact, I'm not sure what the difference is between a fir and a pine. It's a large family of trees, and they have these things growing on them. They're called fir cones. Sometimes they're called pine cones. In the past, a long time ago, back in medieval times, we didn't have the word fruit in English, and all fruit was called an apple. Didn't matter what kind of fruit it was, they were all called apples. And these things that grew on the pine trees were known as pineapples. And that's why when people went off to foreign tropical countries and they discovered these fruits in the Caribbean, I believe, they called them pineapples because they looked like these things that grow on pine trees. So we are not as crazy as you might think. And another strange fruit is the grapefruit. The grapefruit looks nothing like a grape. When I was a child, I thought they were called great fruits, and it appears that I might not have been too far from the truth. The grapefruit, often called a pomelo in Spanish, but apparently it's not. The grapefruit that we eat today is a hybrid. It's a cross between a pomelo, whatever that was, and a sweet orange. So the modern grapefruit is not a pomelo. But anyway, the Latin name of the pomelo is Citrus maxima. So it seems that people started calling these things grapefruits. It seems like there was some confusion in the past, and we ended up calling it grapefruit, and that accounts for why that's such a strange name as well. And those are my interesting facts about fruit. So this week's topic for discussion in the meeting point was the topic of influence, and there were some very interesting new ideas that came up in the conversations that I had not included in the questions, but I will include them next time this subject comes up in the book in a few years' time. There were things like the weather came into the conversation, how much the weather influences people's behaviour and societies in general, and for example how the Mediterranean character might be formed partly because of the weather, which was an interesting way of looking at it, a different viewpoint which I'd not considered before. We also discussed on Wednesday, I think it was, the effect of empires and the effect that one country has upon another. So we have a lot of influence, cultural influences that come from America now. And of course the British influence on many countries around the world and the Spanish influence on South America. So this was another aspect that I hadn't really considered. I hadn't foreseen the conversation going in this direction. An early example of cultural influence is going back to Roman times, and archaeologists have found the remains of Roman-style buildings in Britain which predate the Roman Empire expanding as far as Britain. So even before the Romans arrived, there were certain people who were already being influenced by the styles of architecture across the Channel in France. People had obviously travelled. People of some substance with a bit of financial backing had travelled over to the continent, seen these new style Roman villas and taken the style back with them in pretty much the same way as now we have American influences on music and fashion and films and things like that. Even back in those days, the influence of the Roman Empire actually extended beyond its boundaries. And we were talking about the effect of aristocracies and how the upper classes influence the people lower down. One of the stories that I was researching was Catherine of Braganza, who was of the Portuguese royal family, and she married Charles II of Britain. And with her, she brought the habit of drinking tea. People in England didn't drink much tea before she came along. The Portuguese royal family were very big fans of tea drinking. And when the new queen came to England, she brought this tea drinking habit with her. And of course, those aristocratic ladies and the important people around the palaces, they imitated the queen, as they would. And then other people imitated them, and eventually it went down through the society until it became a common thing. And with the marriage, she came with a dowry, which meant that the English crown sort of came into possession of Bombay, or Mumbai as it is called now. But apparently that was a Portuguese port. It was held by the Portuguese, and part of the dowry when she got married was that city, which led in a large part to the expansion of Britain in India. So she brought the tea drinking habit, and of course later on they got the tea plantations started in India. Originally it was a very expensive commodity coming from China, but after that time they started planting tea in India, and of course then the costs came down and it spread out through the rest of society. All the poor people could then afford tea. But that was the influence of Catherine of Braganza on Britain. We were also discussing the fact that the Queen Victoria was married into the German royal family, and a lot of the Christmas traditions that we have in Britain actually came from Germany, and it was Prince Albert's influence coming from the German royal family. The royal family had a Christmas tree in the palace when they celebrated Christmas, and other people thought, oh look, the Queen's got a tree, we must do the same. So other aristocratic families decided they would have Christmas trees, and over the years it spread just like the tea. It went down through from the higher people down to the lower people until everybody had a Christmas tree. One of the questions in the book that we were looking at was, who have been the biggest influences on your lives? And everybody admitted that they suppose brothers and sisters, parents, uncles and aunts must have been an influence. In some cases, people supposed that teachers must have been an influence. But it was more of a general influence, and it was very difficult to pinpoint exactly one person that was the big mentor or role model in people's lives. Then somebody came up with a very interesting observation that if you asked that question to a musician or an artist, they would have no doubt who those influences were, and they would have much stronger opinions. And it's true, if you ever hear of an interview with a guitarist and they say, so who were your main influences when you were younger, they reel off a list of Chuck Berry, Charlie Christian, Django Reinhardt. They list all these names of great guitar players that influenced them. So they have a much clearer idea of who their influences were, which was an interesting observation that I'd never really thought about. We were also, of course, we got onto the topic of influential speakers. We discussed Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Greta Thunberg. Yes, I put Greta Thunberg in the same group there. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Of course, we discuss Martin Luther King because we've been studying the famous I Have a Dream speech. And of course, this week, Friday evening, was the final meeting to discuss the Martin Luther King speech. So thank you to the 6 or 7 people that came for that meeting. That's the final one now. And in the future, what do we have coming up? We have another beer and tortilla event coming up towards the end of March, and then next trimester we'll be looking at some short stories. So that's all I have time for this week. I hope that's been interesting and maybe influential on your lives. Next week we're looking at the topic of habits and routines. We have some more pronunciation problems to look at that I've already got planned, which were really from this week, but I'm saving them for next week. And I'm sure there'll be more fascinating conversations, and maybe I'll have a suffix of the week. Who knows? So, have a good week. Till next week. Bye.